All right, should we get started? Hi, everyone. Hi, welcome for those of you who are joining us today, and also welcome to those of you who are joining us for the very first time. I'm Deidre, and I am the workshop designer at Live in Farms, and I will be your webinar instructor for today. All right, let's see. Okay, so just for those of you who are new to the Demio platform, just know that you should be able to see the presentation below, and feel free to make my screen smaller or larger depending on what you want. For today, we're going to be going over food waste processing, and this will be part 2 of food waste processing. In the first food waste processing lesson, we actually looked over the difference between organic and inorganic waste. Remember, organic waste can be decomposed if we put it in the soil, while inorganic waste like plastics and metals and glass, for example, cannot if we put them in the soil. And these are important when we start to think about sustainability, just because we can actually process organic waste in our own homes, as opposed to inorganic waste where we're not quite able to do that for ourselves. We did talk about composting as well, since composting is the actual facilitating the breakdown of this organic waste. Generally, it's trying to make it go faster. And fermentation is something a little bit different, although still a type of food waste processing. And that's where we want to preserve the food waste as opposed to just outright breaking it down first. Okay, and for the activity, last time we actually made a Bokashi starter. Bokashi fermentation is one of these types of food waste processes that I talked to you guys about, and it's important for us at Live in Farms because that helps us create a more circular system with our Hive explorers. And today I'm going to be showing you guys how to set up your own Bokashi bin, and we'll be talking a bit more about Bokashi fermentation in general. And at the very end, we'll have a question and answer section. I do have some questions pre-prepared, but it would be really awesome if you guys think up of anything. Please feel free to ask. We do have facilitators joining us today, so they can help me. They can help me narrow down the questions that you guys are sending in. So please do that. It can be about the Bokashi bin process. It can be about composting, about mealworms, or the Hive Explorer. All right, so let's first talk about the Bokashi bin as a system, because systems are something we've been talking about before in the last few webinars, especially I think the systems webinar was webinar number 2. And remember that in a system, you have 3 main components. You have an input, which is what you put into the system. You've got the process, which is the change that happens. And then you've got the output, which should be something completely different than what you put in there. And in a Bokashi bin, which I have an example of it right here, okay, our input will be the fresh food waste, which is something we generate on a day-to-day basis. It's completely natural. And also the Bokashi starter, which I also have right here. This is from last time. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to put that all in here. I'll show you guys how. And what we want to happen, because within the Bokashi starter is actually a bunch of microorganisms that we've been growing. And we want those microorganisms to start to break down and eat the food waste, but we want that to happen with no air, because that's what the fermentation process needs in order for us to be able to keep everything. Okay, and the output that we should get out of that is the fermented food waste itself, and also something called Bokashi juice. I mentioned a little bit about this last time, but just to recap, Bokashi juice is all the water that is going to be taken out of our food waste, because food waste has a lot of water in general, and in order to preserve it, we need to remove all that water or it'll start to go foul. And the Bokashi juice is something that we can keep. You've got the nozzle right here, which is what we're going to use to drain the juice. And once you have the juice, keep it in like a glass jar, an old jar, some kind of bottle that you have, because once you get that juice, you can mix it 1 part juice to 10 parts water, and that can be used to water your plants and give them a nutritional boost. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about the Bokashi fermentation process, the bin, and how that relates to the Hive Explorer. And remember that in the past webinars, I've talked about how the Hive Explorer is also a system. We've got the inputs, we've got the process, which is the digestion process of the mealworms, and we've got the outputs. And what we get out of the output we get out of the Bokashi fermentation process will be the input for our Hive Explorer. The thing with food waste is that it doesn't last very long, right? It starts to go rancid quite quickly. And our mealworms, depending on how many we have in a colony at the time, they might not be able to eat absolutely everything that is coming off of our plates. Generally, they are grain pests, so they do really like the carbohydrates. They do like things like carrots and fresh vegetable peels and some fruits. But other than that, it can be quite difficult on their stomachs. So the great thing about Bokashi fermentation is that we're preserving the food so that they can, so that it'll last longer, so the food doesn't just go bad really quickly. And then there's a few other reasons as well, which are on this next slide. Okay. So the advantages of Bokashi fermentation include the fact that it's space efficient. Like I showed you before, the bin is actually quite small relative to like a large compost heap. This is something that you can just really simply store under your sink. So whenever your family is eating dinner and you guys are done, you just scrape all of that food waste right into the Bokashi bin. Okay, the second advantage of it is that you don't need a backyard. For those of us in Hong Kong, it can be, well, it's very expensive to have a lot of space. Where we can talk about property values some other time, but basically there just isn't a lot of space for many people living in the city. So this is really nice. It's quite small. It's also quite discreet. Once it's closed and it's sealed up, it does have 2 lids. It keeps all the smell in, so you don't really notice it. And there's no smell. It's not an eyesore as long as you keep it under the sink. Like, it shouldn't really bother you. Okay, and I talked a little bit about this 4th point, and that's the fact that it's Bokashi fermentation is a way to preserve your food waste. It makes it last longer, so it doesn't just start to go bad as you're waiting for it to feed your mealworms. And in that way, you can, once it comes out, you can put it in the fridge, and you can keep that there while you're waiting for the mealworms to go through the food waste that they've already been eating. Okay, and another thing is that, like I said, the diet of the mealworms are quite limited. So by doing this process, it actually makes the food more digestible for the mealworms, and in that way, you can feed them a larger variety of foods, because one of the benefits of Bokashi fermentation is that you don't have to worry too much about the things that you're putting into there. It can actually take in a lot of different types of food waste. So I would recommend that if you want to know the differences between what you can put into composting versus Bokashi fermentation, please take a look at our last webinar. Okay, we've got the Bokashi juice, which is another advantage. Again, it can be used to fertilize the plants. And actually, this last part is a bonus because it is a natural pipe cleaner as well. So you can use it to clean your pipes, and you don't have to use the harsh chemicals that actually can be quite damaging once it escapes from the sewage system and eventually ends up either in the treatment plant or further down the line into the ocean. Okay, so these are all really great reasons to get into Bokashi fermentation. And let's talk about how this fermentation actually happens. And it's thanks to these little guys. These are microorganisms. And I'm saying that very generally because there's so many different types of microorganisms. We don't even know the scientific field hasn't even classified every single one of them. We're always discovering new microorganisms. But these guys are pretty powerful, and they are the main drivers when it comes to breaking down or preserving food waste. They're really important in food waste processing. And if you're familiar with soil and the difference between soil and dirt, for example, dirt is literally just it's just the earth and just the minerals. It has nothing alive in it. That's what you would classify as dirt. Whereas soil, on the other hand, what you actually get when you're outside and you're walking in like a forest or in a field and you pick up that dirt, it is actually alive. There's a lot of little things living in there, whether it's the insects that you see running around or these tiny, tiny microorganisms for which you need a microscope to see them. And they play a really important role in breaking down food waste, not just for us, but also out in the natural environment. And they work with insects in order to do that. It's all about recycling matter. Okay, and the term microorganism literally just means organisms for which you need a microscope to look at them. And that's why you can see there's that microscope over there. And in even simpler terms, it just means that we're looking at very, 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 very small living things. Okay, and for example, if we think of the mealworms, which are very small, those are actually not microorganisms, even though they are small, because we can see them with the naked eye. So that's they are going to be considered what we call macroorganisms, like us. Okay, these are larger organisms. And examples of microorganisms will include things like bacteria, E. coli, salmonella. We've got some algae species. We do grow microalgae with our students, and that'll be a different webinar that I'll be introducing to you guys later. And even some tiny insects. There are like dust mites, for example, which are insects that are microorganisms because you can't see them without a microscope. So there's like an entire universe that we can't even see with our naked eyes, which personally I think that's pretty cool. And all right, so when it comes to the Bokashi starter, what we were doing was trying to grow the microorganisms that are helpful to us and try to grow them so that we'll have enough of them to be able to process our food waste. Okay, and we want to cultivate specific types of microorganisms. So if you remember last time, I had you guys put the Bokashi starter in 2 plastic bags and just press out all the air from it. And that's because the microorganisms we'll be growing today need to grow in anaerobic environments with no air. And we're going to still have that environment within the Bokashi bin as well. Okay, and we want to use their natural process of digestion, of like actually consuming the food, and use that natural process to benefit us. And that is something that can be quite useful to us as well. Like I said, this is all part of the Bokashi fermentation process. And these microorganisms that we're growing are super important because they've been used for thousands of years that humans have been around to make things like wine, to make beer, to make bread. And we use them without even really thinking about them, but they're quite important to our own livelihoods and also the way that we consume food. Okay, and let's just talk a little bit about how we can help them grow. Like I said, we wanted absolutely no air, right? We also need a place that's cool and damp. So after you make this, I remember I told you guys, do not put it in the sun. You want to put it somewhere quite dark. It can be under a sink. It can be under your bed. You want to keep the moisture in, which is what the plastic bags will do, the air out, also what the plastic bags will do, and then just keep it cool. So that's your job. You need to put it out of the sunlight. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about what happens if we do accidentally put air into, if it comes into the system. The air will facilitate the growth of different types of microorganisms. And so you could end up growing microorganisms that don't do the job that you need. And you'll know automatically when that has happened, because as soon as you open the Bokashi starter or even the Bokashi bin, you'll smell a very foul smell. So when we think of landfills and dirty landfills, that we think of just like the odor, and it's very strong. And that only occurs in landfills where the organic matter is starting to decay and rot out in the air. So that's the smell that we're smelling. But if you see landfills where they don't allow that to happen, they either remove all the food waste or they always close it up right away, then there actually isn't that much of a smell to those landfills. Okay, so let's look at the bin again. Right, I have my bin here. You can see there's this big bin. It can hold quite a bit of food waste, but it really depends on how much food you are throwing out. Remember, the best way to avoid all this food waste is to actually eat everything on your plate. But of course, if you're chopping up vegetables and things, there's always going to be a little bit of waste. Okay, so you can actually make your own Bokashi bin, or you can just buy one like this as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically for Bokashi, but you want it to have certain components. So we've got the bin, we've got the nozzle, like I said. If you open it up on the inside, there needs to also be this seal right here, because this is where we want to make sure that there's no air getting in. Okay, and as you can see, there's this second lid, which is also important. And then on the inside, we actually have a little stage. I don't know what the proper name of this is, but let's call it a small stage. And so you'll see that the bin goes down, and we put the stage inside. And you need to put that stage because this is how we're going to drain the water. Once you put the food waste on top and the Bokashi starter, we're going to be pressing it down with something like this, but you don't have to use this specifically. You can use your hands, or you can use like a spoon or some kind of something that can press the food down. And we're going to use that to squeeze out all the water. Okay. Okay, so the Bokashi bin is made up of the bin itself, the spigot, that nozzle in the front, the second lid. We've got the sealant on the outer lid, and then we've got the stage. Okay. And when it comes to setting up the Bokashi bin itself, we want to be able to layer it in a particular way. And the most important thing is that you want to have quite a bit of Bokashi starter. I only made a little bit because we actually utilize quite a few methods in my own house to get rid of a lot of the food waste. So I didn't make too big of a batch, but you do end up using quite a bit of food waste. So just keep that in mind when you make your own. You want to start with, in the lowest layer, you want to start with about 2 centimeters of Bokashi starter at the bottom. And then that's when you're going to start to put food waste. And then you're going to put like 0.5 centimeter of Bokashi starter again, and then more food waste. And you're just going to layer that on top of each other. You want to make sure that there's enough food waste where the microorganisms can reach into it, while also having enough surface area where they can actually start to eat it. Because if you start to put big peels without cutting it up, then the microorganisms are not going to effectively be able to consume that food waste. Just remember, they're very tiny. Okay, and just an additional tip, you can also wrap the whole thing in a recycled plastic bag, or just if you did happen to forget your reusable shopping bag, then from that plastic bag that you had to get that one time, like you just put the whole bin inside there, and you can keep even more air out just to be safe. Okay, so when it comes to actually putting things into your Bokashi bin, here's a list of things that you can and can't put in. I'm not going to read all of it out to you guys, but just take a look at that. I mean, it's pretty it's pretty intuitive once you understand that you don't put any inorganic materials, don't put a lot of grease, because the oil, the microorganisms have trouble breaking down the oil, and then also liquids, because you are trying to remove all the water. You don't want to add more liquid in there. Okay. And so a great thing about Bokashi bin over, say, composting, for example, is that you can put in things like meat as long as you cut them up. You can put things like eggshells, citrus. Those are things that don't necessarily go into a lot of the other types of food waste processing methods. So this is great. It takes in a lot of different types of food waste. And as long as you keep all these other types of waste, the ones on the right-hand column, you keep those out, you should have a pretty good bin setup. Okay, and when it comes to maintenance of your bokashi bin, you're going to want, like I said, you're going to want to layer the food in a way that that the microorganisms can get to them pretty quickly. And I'm going to show you guys actually now how to fill the bokashi bin. Okay, oops, excuse me. All right, sorry, just give me a moment. All right, I hope everyone can see that. I'm going to remove the slideshow for 1 second. Okay, so everyone can see, right? Got the bin. And what I have here is actually a lot of food waste I've been collecting. Okay, it's a lot of water spinach. There's some rice in there. Got some banana peels. And actually, as you can see, because it's kept in a plastic bag, is that there's a lot of condensation. And this is from the water that's in the food naturally. And that's what we're going to want to remove from the food. Okay, so remember the first thing that we want to do is take our it's going to be to take our starter. Okay, so I'm going to be opening the starter. This, you should have let it sit for 2 weeks since the last webinar. Generally, that's about how long you want to keep it anyway. And we're going to open it for the first time. So you should have just let it be and sit by itself for the last 2 weeks undisturbed. So this should be the first time that you're opening it, or the second time if you wanted to take a peek earlier. Okay, and I recommended using rice bran in your bokashi starter, although in my own house we didn't have that. So what I'd used instead was oats, which I ground up. And as long as it's another type of grain, it's actually okay, but you want to make it quite fine. Okay, and this is what I have. This is oats, so it may look a tiny bit different than yours. And you can see there's like a little bit of white here. If you see some white mold or white, like white things on top, that's actually okay, so long as there's nothing brown or black, because that will indicate the presence of air that got in, and you should actually be able to smell the foul stench. But for now, when you open it and smell it, you want to be able to look at it, look for those, whether it's white or brown or what colors you see, and you also want to be able to smell it. So there should be no foul stench. It should actually smell quite sweet, and that is from the alcohols and the sugars that are produced from this fermentation process. So as long as you did it correctly and you didn't expose it to too much air, there shouldn't be a bad smell. Okay, so you want to look at it, so visual, smell, and then you also want to feel it as well. It's actually, as I mentioned before, it's nice not to use gloves, even though people do get a little freaked out sometimes by things being dirty, but it is good to feel. You just want to make sure it's not too wet, it's not too dry. And so we're in a good place. So just put that to the side for now. I'm going to open the bin again. Put that here. Okay, and I'm going to start filling the bin now. I'm going to take this starter and I'm going to crumple it. Okay, I want to kind of spread it out. It can be a little messy here, doesn't it? This is still science. It's just we don't need to be quite as exact, which is nice. This is the fun part. Okay. Make sure you've crumpled it quite a lot. Like I said, we want to increase surface area. We want to increase the points at which the microorganisms can touch the food so that they have better access to the food and are going to be better equipped at fermenting the food that we want them to ferment. Okay, you can be quite generous here. Trying to avoid the hole. And I did put measurements, like I said, 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters, but actually you can, as long as you're putting quite a bit at the bottom and then you layer it with the food and you don't put too much, you can kind of feel your way through it and you can experiment as well. Okay, so this is pretty good. If the hole in the middle was a little smaller, I would spread it through the middle too. Just know that that's why I'm doing that. Okay, so you can see I've ground it up. Right. I've got that sweet odor, which is nice. And I've got some of the food waste. Okay. Got some, the first one is a banana peel. For these bigger pieces, we do want to break them up a little bit. Banana peels are actually something you can feed directly to the mealworms, which is good. They love the inside of the banana peels. But especially if you don't have time to feed them right away or you already gave them something else to eat, this is a good alternative. Okay. Let's see what else I have. I have some orange peels. Orange peels, because they contain citric acid, they're usually for different types of composting or food waste processing, such as vermicomposting that uses earthworms. You won't actually be able to put citrus peels in them because the earthworms can't handle them. But because we're processing them beforehand, it's okay to put them in here. And they can break down by the time that the worms get to them. I also have got a little shrimp tail. I'm gonna just break that up a little. Got some rice on there too. Okay. And I've got a lot of morning glory. That's actually most of what's in this bin. Okay. Morning glory is another thing I like to feed my mealworms. This is what's available here in Asia. Also, I'm Indonesian, so we really love to eat morning glory. Okay, and before I put the rest, I'm going to put another layer of Bokashi starter. It doesn't need to completely cover it. Again, we just want to increase the surface area. More. Okay, and then let's go for another layer of food. This is mostly just rice and morning glory, water spinach. This is, you can see this is an Indonesian household. It'll be interesting to see if you guys actually send in pictures of, if you tried to do this at home, send in pictures of the food waste your house generates. It'd be pretty interesting. I don't know where you guys are coming in from. Feel free to write that in. I can take a look at it after I finish this up. There's a lot of rice in here too. I'll put that in. All right. you can see it's just, all it is just alternating between food waste and the Bokashi starter, your microorganisms. Okay. All right, and then finally, whenever you're done, you need to put one last layer of the Bokashi starter on top. So your thickest layers should be your bottom and your top layers. This has been actually one of the lessons that we've been able to teach students here in Hong Kong, at least before the pandemic. And yeah, they love doing hands-on things. A lot of them are quite squeamish about touching food like this or just touching things with their hands. But they get into it pretty quick, and that's always great to see. All right, we're almost done. I just got some final bits of the starter. Okay, and the last thing we need to do before closing up is actually taking this, which is our food masher, and we're going to press it down. And this isn't just to get the water out, because at the moment, not a lot of water is going to come through. You're not going to be able to really collect Bokashi juice yet. But you do want to press all the air out. So that's really what we're doing here. Okay, and once it's good and flat, like that, now we can take our lid and close it up. And the next time that you have food, you just do that process again where you already have Bokashi in here, so you can just go ahead and put, Bokashi starter in here, so you can already put the food waste right on top. Bokashi starter, food waste, cover it with some more Bokashi starter. Okay, and then mash it down again. And then you're going to keep doing that until the bin is all the way, until about like, let's see where you guys can see. Yeah, so just a little bit under the tip. So you see this line right here. That's the rim, right? You just want to go a little below that. Okay, and once that's done, you can close the lid and close this up. Make sure it's tight. And for the time being, you can store that under your sink or somewhere in the kitchen where there's easy access for you and your family. And once that's done, you actually close it up and leave it in the dark for 2 weeks. And during that 2-week process is when you're going to get the fermentation. But every now and again, you are going to have to go in and press the air out. And every, let's say like 3 to 4 days, you're going to check and you're going to try to remove all the water that you can. Then that'll be using the nozzle that you have. Again, collect that in a jar, you know, something like a container that you're not using anymore. And yeah, and save it because you can use that for your plants. Okay, so we actually ended up finishing, or I ended up finishing all of my Bokashi starter. There's just a few crumbs left, and actually these can be fed to the mealworms as well. So they also really like these because it's just grains. And I'll do that later, but if you guys hold on for 1 second, I'm going to wash my hands and then we'll start the Q&A section. All right, 1 second. Okay, so that'll bring us to our questions and answer section. I actually, let's see, necessary, fill the bin. Okay, we've done that. You can take a look at that as well after this. And so let's see, we do have a question here from Angel. Okay, how about leftover foods? Can I put it in the bin? Okay, yes. So everything that I showed you that was in here is actually leftover food. A lot of it is prepped food, food that was still fresh, but yes, you can put cooked food. Just make sure it's not hot. Make sure that you get the grease and the oil out as much as you can, and then you can put it right into the bin as well. It should be fine. If you do have pieces of meat, make sure you do cut things up into smaller pieces, although that's true for actually any of the food. Like I was showing you, you just kind of have to break it up. And yeah, that'll be good. Okay. And in terms of questions, okay, again, please send in your questions. But I do have one question here already. Oh, perfect. Okay, so Angel asked for clarification. She said, okay, that's amazing, even cooked meat, except fried chicken, I guess. Yeah, so cooked meat should be fine. Meat does have a tendency to have a lot of oil, so try not to put too much meat. We do, one of the great ways to move towards a more sustainable lifestyle is to move away from meat anyway. So that is something to consider. Just try to cut your meat up into small pieces. Try to get all the oil out. Use like, you can pat it down with the tissue if it has a lot of oil. Fried chicken, I would guess that because it's fried, it would have too much oil, but I haven't personally tried that. We don't eat a whole lot of fried chicken. But if you want to try that at home, like definitely take notes and give it a try. And as long as you don't put too much in, I would assume that it would actually be okay. Okay, I hope that helped a little, Angel. All right, and I have for you guys again, I have my Hive right here. Oh, I got another question. Okay, so Christina asks, are there any disadvantages to Bokashi fermentation? Okay, yeah, there's a few. It's not, so actually the friends that I have and the people that I know who are the most successful at composting and food waste processing will actually use more than one type of a food waste process in their own home. Usually Bokashi fermentation, they'll use that while also composting outside, while also having a small worm bin. And one of the disadvantages of Bokashi fermentation is that if you don't have the equipment and you're not familiar with how to make a bin, then that can be an issue that not everyone is able to get around. Although once you understand the basic concepts, you can actually make that on your own. And another disadvantage is also that the fermentation process, not everyone wants to have a lot of preserved food because they want to be able to like get rid of the waste preferably, right? And even though Bokashi fermentation is relatively fast compared to composting, you put it outside and you have the soil microorganisms take care of the composting, and then it's done. You can give it straight to your plants. But actually, with Bokashi fermentation, you can give the juice to your plants, but you can't actually give the actual preserved food waste directly to your plants. And if you don't feed it to the mealworms, the original idea is to put it back into the ground, which is not an option that's available to everyone, especially if you're living in the city. Okay, thanks for the questions. Please keep sending them. Okay, I tend to only feed my insects organic food waste. from organic vegetables cutoffs because I was worried about the cumulative effects of pesticides. Does the Bokashi bin help break down things which might be detrimental to our mealworms? Okay, when it comes to pesticides, it can be quite, so pesticides are quite complicated because they are almost always made from organic compounds. But the problem, or they're also made from petroleum, different compounds of petroleum. Because of this, you generally want to always wash your fruits and vegetables. And we tend not to worry about pesticides when we're feeding the mealworms, only because we're feeding them the food waste from our own waste. And so we're preparing it for our own consumption. And as long as it's clean for us, we don't worry too much about the pesticides for them. Because we when it comes to like these guys, we generally want to make sure everything is clean while we eat them, right? I'm not saying that pesticides are not an issue, but generally speaking, for the food that we consume, we're already getting rid of those pesticides, so we wouldn't really worry about them for the mealies. But if you are feeding food like straight from a garden or straight from I don't know, just if you're feeding it straight from the ground and you do know that pesticides have been used there, you do definitely want to give it a much better rinse before you give it to them. This won't get rid of everything, but does a pretty good job. Okay, let's see. Does the Bokashi bin help break down things which might be detrimental to the mealworms? So not necessarily. I'm personally unaware of like how pesticides play into that in terms of how the microorganisms break down things. But we do know that the microorganisms, to the extent that they're fermenting the food, they do break down the food. So at least the food is more digestible to them. It's not necessarily that they're breaking down toxins, but just making the food more easily consumable for the mealworms. I hope that makes sense in terms of like the difference, because I am not familiar with specific studies about the pesticide breakdown. We're still learning a lot about that. But thank you, Sean. Sean, I hope I said that right. Thanks for the questions. Okay, so is there any notable difference between the mealworms when feeding them fermented food waste compared to fresh food waste? Here's another question we have. Okay, notable difference. From my experience, I have not noticed a difference. The food waste that I feed, I generally try to mix it because I don't want to feed purely fresh food waste and purely fermented food or purely fermented food waste. I want to make sure that there's a balanced diet because it's not just good for the mealworms, it's also good for, that's a general rule for us as well, right? We want to change up what they're eating. As long as they have, as long as you continue to put the dry grains in there, the food waste and the fresh food waste will just be supplementary to their diet. And so I haven't noticed a difference in my mealworms. You actually, if you look in here, okay, you'll see that it's quite empty right now. There's only a few beetles. And I have shown in the other videos that I will feed them coffee grinds as well. So that's not something that they generally eat in the wild. But so long as you're varying their diet, then the cumulative effect of one particular food type you shouldn't notice it too much. Okay, you can see it there. Hi guys. They were hiding from the light, which is what they were doing. Hi babies. Okay. And we've got some of the beetles. And like I said, I have some of the extra Bokashi starter, which I can feed them. There you go. Awesome, and they're already starting to eat it. Let's see another question. So, is there anything mealworms cannot eat? Yes. So like I said, there's quite a few things that mealworms can't cannot eat, just because their original diet is mostly that of grains and a few fresh food waste, especially like vegetables and some fruits. But other than that, when it comes to things like eggshells, when it comes to like orange peels, those are things that the mealworms are generally not eating. And that's why we're going to need to put it through this fermentation process before we can feed it to them. Okay, we have another question here. I'm going to turn this so you can see them both. So the next question is, what is the average number of mealworms that can be harvested per week? Okay. And to answer this question, I'll say most generally that it really depends on your own colony. In general, we'll have about 100 to 150 grams, which is about 1,500 mealworms. This is not 1,500 mealworms. And so it'll really depend on the conditions that you're keeping your mealworms in, how big the colony is. And I can actually talk a little bit about food prep, because if you are going to eat your mealworms, you're going to need to prepare them beforehand, because like any animal, they do produce their own waste and they do have their own parasites, and you can't just eat them straight off. Right? This is true. Like, you're not just going to bite into a cow. You're not going to just bite into a sheep. You need to actually harvest the ones that you want to eat, these big guys. You need to put them into a new container. You're going to want to freeze them. So it's a humane way that we put them to sleep. We can give you the exact temperatures for that. And you're going to want to wash them and then boil them. And that's all to clean the mealworms before consumption, right? We want the mealworms to be happy, but of course, with any animal, there will be certain, like depending on the animal, there'll be certain pests and germs that they live very happily with, but we might not necessarily be able to digest. So you could harvest maybe about like 100 of these guys if you want to do that. It'll depend on the size of them, how old they are, how big you want your mealworms, and how happy you're keeping the colony. Okay, and last question is actually a question. Oh, okay, we have another question from Jose. So do you need to manually select each big enough mealworm? Because I think in this new Hive Explorer, there will be really young mealworms coexisting with old mealworms. Okay, yes. So Jose touches on a question just because this particular Hive Explorer, we have like a mix of all ages of mealworms in here. And you might not necessarily want to eat all of them at the same time, because you want to leave the young mealworms so that they can grow and help establish a new colony, right? You don't want to eat all of them and then end up with no mealworms. And so, yes, the Hive Explorer, because of the way that it's designed, which is mostly for the interactive quality, you will have to pick out the mealworms that you want to pick out. Within the package, you will get your own tweezers, you will get your own magnifying glass, some petri dishes. That'll all come included. And that's all so that you can pick out those mealworms yourself. But honestly, like, as long as you wash your hands before and after, like, these guys they're fine. They're not gonna bite. Hi, baby. Okay, so let's see. This may be a tangent for future studies. But I'm very interested to know if there have been any research you're aware of feeding insects mycelium. Okay, we only have a few more minutes, but I'll answer this really quickly. No, I personally have not seen any research on that. Mycelium, you're talking about mushrooms, am I correct? Right? Fungi. So yeah, I don't try to keep mushrooms out of the food that use in the Bokashi fermentation. But if you want to know specifically about the mycelium, I personally haven't seen studies on that. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, and before we go, thank you for all your questions. It's been a very interactive webinar. So I really appreciate that. Okay. And before you guys go, I just want to say that for everyone who attended today, you will get a 20% discount code. So please check that out if you want to. It's only available for those who attended the webinar. And for our next webinar, we're going to be talking about designing future food restaurant concept. And we're going to be looking at the case study of Surabaya in Indonesia and how they actually how they got their community to use food waste processing and insects as well to help reduce the amount of waste that they were producing as an entire city. And this is a city of about 3 million people. Okay, and you can also please check us out at hiveexplorer.com and use the QR code that I have on the screen in order to give feedback. We are very, very new at this whole webinar platform and just hosting webinars in general. I would really appreciate the feedback so that I can get better, we can get better, and hopefully we can give you a better webinar experience. Okay, thanks again, everyone. I'm gonna log off now and keep the screen up for now. Please take a look at our social media. I'll also be putting out a blog post, another blog post. Last time I was talking about detrivores and of insect decomposers in our environment. And during this blog post, I'm going to talk more about different examples. So check that out. Okay, thanks everyone.